Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the Skull Merchant's new story in Tome 15, because this story has a lot riding on it and I have some thoughts about it. Okay, so before we get going, it's worth affirming that I have a very peculiar relationship with this character. Adriana Mai is probably the most divisive original character in this game's history, and you need only see the reactions people had to her on her release, and the reactions people give you when you say anything positive about her or her chapter, to affirm that she hasn't been the best received. Get a load of fresh fits for Skull Merchant and Haddie, characters that I like a lot but wasn't ready to spend actual money on, so giving me options to spend.
You know what? We're changing this video into interrogating Pixel.
Why do you like Skull Merchant? Explain it to me in detail.
Well, I'm happy to oblige!
To be fair, I do see why. Her gameplay leaves a lot to be desired for many killer and survivor players alike, and her lore and visual design is, to put it kindly, an acquired taste. I covered my complex thoughts on her base lore and characterization in a prior video I made a little while ago, and in that video I expressed my mixed feelings about the character and the way she's presented. In short, I found Adriana Mai to be a well-conceived character who was lumbered with a story that didn't appropriately play to her strengths and left her feeling half-hearted in implementation. Her story was missing a few key pieces that could have made her existence more believable. For example, we don't know where she got technical skills to build and maintain her drones, nor how she manipulates her victims into where she needs them to be, to hunt them in the way she clearly enjoys. This issue is caused mostly by overemphasizing her relationship with her father as a child, in lieu of actually exploring her life as an adult. We get a blow-by-blow recounting of her father's career as a manga artist, but that same attention to detail is not given to Adriana's own life, which is awkward when you realise that she's the main character of this story, and should have that detail present in her adult life. Adriana's adulthood, the period in her life that turned her from a bitter teenager dealing with her father's absence into the extravagantly wealthy and arrogant skull merchant who hunts people for sport, is more or less skimmed over. The components were there to make a kind of killer who we hadn't really seen before. Someone who was dealt a not great hand in life, similar to the more sympathetic killers like Spirit, Wraith or Artist, but instead of that difficult background being used as a springboard to generate pathos, Adriana was kind of a bad seed, and the departure of her father was ultimately a result of how she turned out. He left because he foresaw what she was becoming and wanted no part in it. The idea of a killer who was kind of a self-made monster, someone who caused her father's departure by her nascent acts of cruelty and took his abandonment of her in the worst possible way, is something kind of new to this game, when so many killers are products of circumstances outside of their control. But the base story wasn't written anywhere near well enough to appropriately express that concept. So when I heard Skull Merchant would be getting the killer slot in Tome 15, I was very, very hopeful this murkiness and lack of detail where detail was really, really warranted could be resolved. And the end result is odd. Let me start off with what I wasn't so pleased about when I first read through this story. A lot of the basic details needed to fill out Skull Merchant's character that weren't in the base lore still aren't there. Even after her tome, we still don't know some basic things about her that need to be clarified to make this character really tick. For example, we still don't know where she got her drones from. No suggestion that she's mechanically trained or even stole them from anybody in her employment. I know that cinematic and her add-on suggest that she builds them herself, but she's supposed to be an astute business mind, not necessarily a skilled engineer. I wish we had some knowledge of where it all comes from, because it stands at such odds with the business-minded Adriana set up everywhere else in the story. I almost don't care what the answer is, but there should be some sort of answer to resolve the disconnect between her story and gameplay identity. Maybe if we'd had more than 10 minutes between Adriana's release and her tome, we could have had the chance to give feedback to the writers before the tome came out. Wow, who could have possibly predicted that this exact problem could have come to pass from the new tome model, causing a character's tome stories to be written too soon after their release? When I first read the story, which is irritatingly unnamed like every other tome story that came before it, I was a bit peeved about still not knowing how she got her technology and not resolving that disconnect from her base lore. But as I got about halfway through the story, I decided to actually stop reading it and start again, reset my expectations and take the story on its own merit by looking at what the story did give us rather than being bitter about what it didn't. And after giving it a proper read, yeah, I do still think it's a shame we didn't get to see the process behind her drone's creation, but the story did get one thing right. More or less everything else. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't expecting great things from this story, although I was hoping. In part because of how quickly it came out after her release, and in part because, well, it's Skull Merchant. Do you think they're going to give her 110% effort? But no. I was quite pleasantly surprised by the quality of this story, and if you aren't currently battling your gag reflex because someone dared to say something good about the killer that it is heresy to say anything good about, then you might be wondering why. Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, and we see a young Adriana Mai in her default state of indignantly pissed off and not receiving the respect she thinks she is owed. At this time in her life, her father's Saita has already left her and her mother, and the money that kept her in the elite school she grew up in has all but dried up. Far from being the star student anymore, the top of the class that she's gotten used to that's validated her growing ego, Adriana is faced with the reality that she's not the centre of the universe, and just because she's smart doesn't mean she's the only one who deserves the spotlight. Adriana does not take this realisation well, and we get to see her starting to develop the habits and MO that would become characteristic to her later life as a killer. She picks out her target João and dedicates huge amounts of time and patience to monitor his every move. She tracks his routine, tails him on her bike, and plots his downfall to herself, but notably she never actually hurts him herself. Oh, part of her wants to, and she doesn't seem to have any moral opposition to actually attacking him, but she just seems to have cold feet, as she chooses instead to retreat into the pages of her father's manga for guidance. We knew from the base lore that she viewed her father's unpublished manga, Sonadores Sombrios, in a very positive light, and it had a major influence on her life. But the Tome story gives us a bit more context as to how exactly she viewed the manga growing up, and the picture it paints is actually pretty interesting. In Adriana's base lore, she's presented as utterly self-assured, someone who never once doubts herself and displays an arrogance shared by many others in the killer roster, like Trickster, Doctor, and Ghostface. And while that arrogance is preserved in the Tome, it's taken in a unique direction this time around, because while we've seen characters like Ghostface and Doctor before using their overweening arrogance to more or less act with impunity, just because Adriana shares that arrogance doesn't mean that it translates to the same self-assuredness. She's confident that she's better than everybody else, but that doesn't mean she's confident that she actually knows what she's doing. Stuck in decision paralysis, Adriana turns to Sonadores Sombrios and its lead character, the Skull Merchant, and looks for some clue or indication as to the path she should take next. The idea of Adriana basically taking after a manga character lost a lot of people and prevented them from buying into the Skull Merchant as a serious character. I think the way the Tome goes about this angle though is actually kinda cool, because it's obvious that Adriana doesn't buy into the Skull Merchant persona wholesale. She can actually tell the difference between fiction and reality. Instead, she uses the pages of Sonadores Sombrios as a way to reconnect to her absent father, because despite her massive ego, Adriana Mai does not know what she wants to do with her life. She dances on the edge of actually hurting people, of becoming the murderer that we know her to be, but she's too preoccupied in her own self-doubts and effectively mourning Saita's disappearance to go the whole 9 yards. This puts her in quite a unique position, that I don't think we've seen many killers in before. Most of our killers are either sadistic tormentors who revel in their power and ego to cause massive harm, or they're good people, who try to do the best they can, but are led down a dark path by their relative lack of control over their circumstances. Adriana fits into neither category. She's almost as morally bankrupt as DVD's most despicable characters, but she still feels out of control of her own life, because things aren't going the way she wants them to. Her performance in class is slipping, and she doesn't know how to deal with disappointment. She needs guidance and assurance that she's doing the right thing, but doesn't really respect anyone enough to actually listen to them, so she retreats from human interaction that might actually make her into a better person, into something that reminds her of better days. But by projecting her hardships, and I use hardships in a somewhat generous term, considering that she's still a highly accomplished student at an elite academy, onto the Skull Merchant, Adriana puts herself into this spiral of becoming a worse and more isolated person because her massive ego convinces her that everybody else is the problem, which only pushes her to further isolate herself and thereby feed that ego even more. What we're witnessing here is a young woman who's well and truly careening off the deep end, because she's too proud and egotistical to admit that she needs help. There's even a reading of this story that I think paints Adriana as a potential case of borderline personality disorder, or BPD. According to Healthline, borderline personality disorder is a type of personality disorder in which a person has difficulty processing or managing their emotions, and a lot of symptoms of BPD Healthline lists can be recognised in the early part of Adriana's story. There's obviously some that don't fit, such as self-harm and suicidal thoughts, but a lot of the behaviours Adriana displays in the story do correlate with BPD. Big ones that stood out to me are efforts to avoid abandonment, impulsive behaviours, anger issues, and perhaps dissociation from one's body. It's clear Adriana has difficulties dealing with her father's abandonment of her and her mother, and is attaching to the last thing he left behind as a way to deal with that. Refusing to associate with others so that she doesn't have to risk them leaving her again. Hell, she never even talks about her mother Belinda in this story, despite her being still present in her life at this time. Anger issues and impulsive behaviours kind of speak for themselves, but the dissociation idea comes from how Adriana seems to inherit the personality of the Skull Merchant over time, as her expectations about how she thinks her life should go fail to be fulfilled. There's an argument that she dissociates from being Adriana Mai as she embraces the Skull Merchant's way of life, which would explain why she keeps planning on doing horrible things to Joao as vengeance, but doesn't really have the follow-through, because she isn't engaged enough in her own life to have a proper plan to set it back on course. Before we continue, this is in no way meant to be a diagnosis of Adriana. I'm not a psychologist, and trying to pathologise what could simply be a case of extreme narcissism, gone unchecked, may be a fool's errand. This is just an observation that some of her actions and feelings are congruent with BPD symptoms. I thought the video would be incomplete without at least bringing up the possibility. So with that, our exploration of Adriana's youth ends, and we have a time skip to finally see her as an adult, in her element as a patient and meticulous hunter. But the time skip is illustrated in a really intelligent way. Adriana's youth and adult life are demarcated by a memory taken from her father's manga, Soñadores Sombríos itself, so we can see a day in the life of the fictitious skull merchant Adriana seems to look up to. The brief window we're given into her grim dark cyberpunk world is kind of the story practicing what it preaches. Adriana seems willing to abandon reality to treat this book like her Bible, so it's only fair that we get to see what story she's taking so seriously. Truth be told, it feels like a fairly generic cyberpunk manga setting, which I guess explains why she's struggling to find deep meaning from it, and maybe why her father's publishing house dropped it. The name Neo de Janeiro goes pretty hard, but in general, a lot of the tropes you'd expect from a fairly bog-standard cyberpunk setting exist in this brief interlude. It's implied to be this oligarchical technocracy where the wealthy show off these gaudy displays of status in these virtual worlds, and the Skull Merchant exists to disrupt that social order. She hunts the wealthy and powerful, those who have put up a good fight but have grown placid in satisfaction with their cushy lives at the top. This subversive attitude would certainly appeal to a young Adriana, whose perceived rival she sees as belonging to this secure and self-satisfied upper crust she seems dedicated to cracking. When we flash forward to her as an adult, we see something very different. At this stage of her life, Adriana is fabulously wealthy, and has a cutthroat and ruthless approach to squeezing as much money as she can out of the company she's acquired. She's brutally efficient and has zero concern for anyone else that gets hurt in the process, and on paper at least this really fits with her self-centered egotism established before. What we can see when we look a little bit closer is that all this talk of being subversive and cracking the armour of those confident in their wealth has rung hollow over time. After all, now she's the wealthy autocrat, who sees herself as above everybody else and is utterly confident in her wealth and power, making her rather similar to the people that she's going after in a way that she's nowhere near self-aware enough to realise. It's yet another way Adriana's massive ego manifests in this story. She's so self-obsessed she doesn't even realise that she's kind of become the thing she hated. In general, this version of Adriana, who spent years seeking out connection in her father's manga, feels like a much more complete and self-assured person, and is way more capable of taking action in advance of her own interests rather than simply ceding quietly to herself. She's more competent, she's a more skilled planner, and is less impulsive, not taking direct action against someone till she's sure that it'll benefit her. And it's at this point, when she's forensically trawling through this old soldier's life and figuring out exactly how to give herself the most thrilling and rewarding hunt possible, that Skull Merchant finally made sense to me. Adriana Mai never really needed guidance. She never needed help, she never needed her father's manga or the character of the Skull Merchant. Hell, she never even really needed her father to come back to her. Adriana Mai needed an excuse. Some sort of facade she could put on to let her hurt people without repercussions. That's what the Skull Merchant is. She's a persona Adriana can put on to indulge what she's always wanted to do but can't do as a cutthroat business executive she's become. Think about it. In her business ventures, she's pragmatic to a fault and completely emotionally detached from the people she's dealing with. But when she's alone and given the power to inflict violence without repercussions, she's far from detached at all. She endeavours to understand her target on a very intimate level, to twist the knife in every single way she can to make her hunt truly memorable. She can't do that in the boardroom, just as she couldn't do it as a young woman, because as Adriana Mai, there are consequences to her actions. She can't just murder her opposition right there in the boardroom, obviously, so she has to put on the mask of civility detachment and operate with cold efficiency instead. When it's just her and her target, we truly get to see the Skull Merchant in her element, and her cruelty manifests in her focused desire to tailor each hunt perfectly to her victim's past and personality. As the Skull Merchant, there is no need to hide your depravity. You simply do what you want, and nobody can stop you. Her delusions of grandeur muddle even the memories she has of her father, as the story ends with her treating her adoption of the Skull Merchant persona as a sort of memorial for her father and his work, as if in some way he'd be proud of what she's made of herself. But in her egotism, her rampant self-obsession, she doesn't understand that not only would her father be horrified to see his daughter turned into a serial killer, the realisation that she was on this dark path may have been what drove him away in the first place. A common theme in many DBD stories is that the lines between fiction and reality are blurred, and traumatised or emotionally distressed creative minds can see alternate realities which they translate into stories. It's implied that Saito saw what his daughter would become, perhaps even saw the Skull Merchant, and ran from her life because he thought if he left, if Soñadores Sombríos was now published, she'd move on, and her fate as a sadistic Skull Merchant would be averted. But his departure, if anything, ensured this vision would come to pass. After he left, Adriana's aggression and egotism ran rampant and unchecked, and the end result is right here. A testament to Saito's failures as a parent. A distillation of egotism, selfishness, and cruelty given physical form. A woman so utterly self-obsessed that the same father she kills in the name of turned his head in shame when he saw what she would become. A bottomless pit of ego that demands endlessly to be fed with not just violence but domination, as everyone around her becomes simply tools to validate her ravenous ego and monolithic self-image. Adriana Mai didn't have to become a monster, and had Saito acted differently, she could have led a very different life, but it's far too late for that now. The Skull Merchant's Tome story is almost everything I'd originally hoped her base lore would be. It tracks her life from her youth as she struggles to manage her expectations of the world around her, and develops that superiority complex, and follows her into her adulthood where that complex manifests into a patient and meticulous hunter tracking only the most dangerous game. Her base lore was too preoccupied with her father's career and her family's financial troubles, when all that was window dressing. What I've always wanted to see, and what we finally have here, is a Skull Merchant in her element. The ultimate egomaniac on an endless quest for validation. If you are one of these people who fundamentally hate Adriana as a character, I know there's many of you out there who do, this story is unlikely to win you over. Truth be told, I don't think any Skull Merchant story could ever win over the truly dedicated haters. That was never going to happen. But if you're the kind of person who's willing to give this story a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of goodwill, to let it paint the picture it wants to paint, I think you're pleasantly surprised. I had to read it twice to properly cleanse myself of my expectations and treat this story in good faith. I'd recommend the same thing to anyone else reading it. The story is not perfect. It doesn't address some of the issues I had with the base lore, but it far exceeded my expectations, and if this is the only story content Skull Merchant is ever going to get in the future, it's most definitely good enough for me. Right, so that's everything I have to say about the Skull Merchant. What do we all think? I have a feeling this video may be a little bit controversial, so leave your thoughts in the comments and I'll be sure to have a read of them. In the meantime, do feel free to subscribe if you're interested in seeing more lore videos and many other exciting things coming out from me. This Monday I'll be attending the launch event for Convergence, an upcoming Riot Forge game set in the League of Legends universe, and I'll be recording the whole thing. So there'll be a video on that coming out at some point fairly soon, I hope. But yeah, I'm really excited to go. But before that, I have a tier list that needs to be addressed. A certain funny Spanish YouTuber recently posted a tier list that put the twins in the middle of B tier for playing them on the current patch, and yeah, I have something to say about that. So I haven't covered twins in a hot minute on this channel, so it's probably high time I do that. Guess I'll see you then. Ta-ta for now.